So we've tried to arrange the area here in the front for our presenters, discussants, and paper panelists. If you need to have additional seating, we have the second room in the back reserved as well. So if we could try to coordinate ourselves that way, that would be excellent. Thank you.
My pleasure, please. Thank you for having me.
Sure.
Did I unplug anything?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conference. We've been working on this the past month, and I hope everyone traveled in, obviously safely, but comfortably. Thank you. We've had a couple of issues with the internet this morning, but we have figured it out. So I'm going to read you the login info right now, and then we'll be putting out, pieces of paper on the tables. So the username is going to be Allison Keir, ALLISON, Keir, KEIR, and that's at yahoo.com. And the password is C as in Charlie, B as in boy, D as in David, B as in boy, 07, B as in boy, number 3. If you have any issues, let me know. They had trouble with their guest user access email, so we had to take another route. So we'll begin, and we're serving lunch at 12:30 today, and then I think about 3:30 you'll be wrapping up, and we'll walk across the street to a DeFleur lecture that they'll be having in the Platonic Center, and then you'll be going to a very lovely dinner after that. So enjoy.
So I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of you for being here. As you know, we've been working on coordinating this event for quite a long time. We've received a robust number of submissions, and I think we really are doing a very interesting and exciting panel, a group of researchers and presenters that we've come together today to look at and examine this idea of streaming television, binge watching, and second screening, which of course have become global phenomenon, but that haven't received so much attention in the scholarly or empirical literature. So I'm very excited, very happy you all are here. Thanks again for coming. And I'd like to turn things over now to our Dean, Tom Fiedler, for some opening remarks. Thanks very much.
You can probably hear me. I'll use this just in case those of you back in the bleachers back there can hear everything that goes on. When Dr. Groszek says opening remarks, I think he set the bar much higher than what you're about to hear from me. I am delighted to be here. I want to add my thanks to Allison Keir for working on this so hard. Obviously, Dr. Groszek, too, for bringing this idea forward. Dr. Katz, who's the director of our Emerging Media Studies program, and our faculty. Dr. Howell, who is here studying television. And I am the dean of the College of Communication. The College of Communication is multidisciplinary, includes film, includes television, and strategic communication and journalism. That's my background, and I'm actually was a practitioner. in journalism. So I come at this in very much probably the role of the audience, the expected audience, hoping to learn something. What I found fascinating about this when the idea was first proposed to do a symposium, a conference on binge watching, I thought, well, this is it's certainly it's unique, or it's relatively unstudied, because it's new in terms, at least in my experience, of what we think about when you hear that phrase. I think most of us associate binge watching with what we see with Netflix, HBO, Hulu, those now where probably didn't exist, much more than 5 years ago, where you would have the capability to sit at home and go through an entire season of shows that you may or may not have wanted to see. You know, Lost, and we thought a few of those. And maybe HBO started. I think the first was Netflix that I'm familiar with, where they released an entire season of House of Cards on the same day. I may be wrong about, but I seem to remember that, and I thought, who in the world would want to sit down and watch what would amount to 12 or 13 or 14 weeks of television in one sitting? And obviously Netflix knew what it was doing, or was it HBO? Which one does? It is Netflix on one season, and you find out millions of people do. But suddenly you start seeing stories about, first the word binge watching seems to evoke a pejorative. Anything you do that's on a binge is not good for us, I think. You know, binge drinking, right away, we don't want to do that. You go on a binge. So we've seen a debate about whether binge watching is healthy or unhealthy. I believe I saw a number, 61% of Americans now admit to binge watching. And whether that has an impact on our health, psychologically, physically, it kind of goes back and forth. And I just saw an article, I think, in The Conversation the other day from someone who decided that binge watching is actually healthy within limits. But the question that I would come up with is, now wait a minute, we've done something similar in so many parts of our lives and don't really think twice about it. I mean, how often have you seen almost the stereotype on Sunday afternoon of the usually the man in the household, although that's less, of binge football watching. You know, you start at 1 in the afternoon. Actually, you probably do the pregame well before noon, and you watch all the way through to Sunday night football. So if that's not binging on something, then I don't know what is. So you have that, and all of us probably have had experiences in our school years of going into the final exam without having read at least 1 or 2 books, and you sit down for a full day and plow through 400 pages. Binge reading, I don't think we've ever heard that. That wasn't considered a negative thing. And athletics, and how many people here ran the Boston Marathon or have run a marathon, you know, now binge running? We think that's great. So, but I think it's going to be an interesting discussion to have as we look at what is binge watching, what is the impact on the people who create the content and style it for that, certainly what is the impact, if we can determine it, on the people who use it, and then Dr. Groshek mentioned the multi-screen experience. It has become, I think, the norm now in so many things where you sit down and you're viewing, but at the same time you're communicating with people who are sharing that viewing experience. I think that's probably where even the wide use of the hashtag came from, a way to share a common experience. So, you know, you don't watch a presidential debate anymore just by watching the debate. You watch that debate while you're also tweeting with other people, responding, and then seeing what's going on. So we've really gone off into some very interesting areas now, and my piece of this is to try to soak in as much as I can about what has been studied, and perhaps I will hear other questions raised. But I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come and be part of this experience, and hopefully at the end of it we will have moved a little bit forward about what this is all about, whether it's binging or whether this is something probably a good thing for us to do. So Jacob, back to you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Very much, Tom. Okay, thanks again for those wonderful and very thoughtful remarks. On that point, I would like to call your attention to the signage around the building, encouraging you, in fact, to participate in the very thing we're studying, right? So art becoming, alive itself here. So do mention us with the hashtag #SocialTV@BU. Do follow us on Twitter. We encourage your comments, engage. We have a live stream going for those folks that are participating remotely. Please do send in your questions, thoughts, feedback. We'll do our best to monitor and engage with those. Now that I've spoken far too much, I want to turn things over to our opening address from Pablo Boczkowski. He is a professor and director of the Masters in Leadership for Creative Enterprises program at Northwestern University. He is also the co-director for the Center for the Study of Media and Society in Argentina. His research program looks at the transition from print to digital media with a focus on the organizational and occupational dynamics of journalism as examined through a comparative lens. He is the author of 3 books, 1 edited volume, over 25 journal articles, and 50 conference presentations. He is gracious enough to join us here today and to deliver his talk called the Social Network News. So thanks very much. If we could have a warm welcome for Pablo.
Please. Thank you, everybody. And let's see if I can do this. Not this one. This one. There you go. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me in the back without this, or yes? I don't need this? All right, I shout a little bit. It's better rather than having to hold that. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Dean Fiedler. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jim, for the invitation to be here. It's really a pleasure to be sharing some of my work in progress with you. I was going to address a different part of this project more centrally, having to do with the social lives of personal screens, which you'll see some of that in this talk. But after I learned that Byron Reeves will be talking about living in the media this afternoon, and Homero will be doing the closing keynote, I figured I would adapt a little bit the presentation, hopefully to try to connect with their presentations as well, have a little bit more of a holistic approach. Now, this is very much work in progress. Feel free to ask questions and comments and give me feedback at any point in time. It will be most appreciated. I am in the process of a little bit taking the ideas on the road to test them in public. Next year, I'm going to go on sabbatical, and together with my collaborators, we're going to take advantage of that downtime to sit down and write a book, hopefully. We'll see how that goes. So without further ado, let's get started. In a report that Pew released only a couple of months ago, among other things, they asked people how they access news and information when they are online, whether they go to websites directly or they access them through search engines or through social media. And the population as a whole, more or less the same amount of people access the information directly on the news sites and going through social media. Now, if we look at the younger segment of the population, those 18 to 29, twice as much, right, access happens for them through social media rather in comparison to the people who are 50 and older. This data is consistent with the data that the Oxford Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism has been putting out in their annual news reports every beginning of the year. The 2017, my understanding is that is coming up fairly soon. This is the most recent one that is available. If you look at, for the US, the sources of news, right? What people say are the main sources of news over the past 4 years. The only trend going upwards has to do with social media. Okay. This is also the case in most countries, most of the 26 countries where they survey data, not all of them. From 15 to 16, we see growth of social media as the main source of news and information. Some exceptions, one most noticeable is the case of Finland, where it stayed flat, and in Germany we didn't see a lot of increase. Consistent also with the data from Pew, is the average of the 26 countries where the survey data, is that accessing news primarily through social media is particularly pronounced among the younger segment of the population, those 18 to 24 in this case. And in 2016, for the first time, social media surpassed television for this age group as the main source of news and information. I was going to show you something, but for some reason, shutting down. Aha. So, okay, technology was playing us a trick. Okay, if somebody can help me reboot this, I can go for a little bit without the slides.
If you have a pause for the live stream, if you could.
I can absolutely do it.
A good use of our time.
So if I were, no problem.
If you like, I can also pull it up.
How do I turn this on? Here, right? There you go. So do you want me to pause or I can continue? If you want to, or I can pause. However, something's up. Okay. The presentation was in the desktop, so if we can open PowerPoint. Yes, that's me. There you go. That was fast. Brilliant. Okay. So this is what one might call a 30,000 feet above the ground view of how people access news and information these days through their different devices. On the ground, it looks something like this. On a Thursday or Friday night, one of our interviewees, Sarah, who is a college student, 21 years of age, in the city of Rosario in Argentina, a city that is probably most famous these days for being the birthplace of Lionel Messi. Omeno would disagree with me on this, but I would still claim that he's the best football player in the world, soccer player in the world. Omeno would probably say Cristiano. I learned, half hour ago. With a Madrid-Barca rivalry here. But in any event, so Sarah, after a long day, goes out with her girlfriends to a bar to have fun and relax, and she wants to see what another group of girlfriends is doing. So what she does, this other group of girlfriends is in another bar. What does she do? She goes on Facebook to see what this other group of girlfriends is posting on Facebook. Now, while she is on Facebook looking for that information, she stumbles upon a piece of news from her hometown newspaper. Right? So it showed up, and it interested her. Therefore, she started reading the news. Did she go out on a Thursday or a Friday night to get the news? No. Did she go on Facebook to get the news? Not really. But while she was living in the media, in part through Facebook, through social media, using the smartphone, she stumbled upon a piece of news. That is a form of consuming news that is characterized by the word incidental, right? It is something that is a byproduct of doing something else. It's something that happens, somewhat accidentally, but not entirely accidentally. Now, incidental news consumption is something that has existed for a very long time. Anthony Downs wrote, an economic theory of democracy about it in 1957, very eloquently, in particular about the cognitive dimensions of accessing the news incidentally. Omeno has written some of the best, probably the best work in this area recently. But our main claim is that incidental news consumption, which used to be something secondary, peripheral, exceptional to the main forms of consuming news and information, as in sitting down to read the newspaper, sitting down to watch television, or listening to the radio, has become now the norm, in particular for the younger segment of the population. Okay? So what was in the past in the periphery has become part of the center. What was exceptional now has become the norm. And what I would like to argue is that if you look at the past 25 years of accessing the news digitally before the commercial web, and in particular since the beginning of the commercial web. This is probably the most remarkable transformation, the most discontinuous transformation in how people consume news and information, and therefore how they receive it and make sense of it. And also becomes a privileged window to observe broader transformations at the intersection of media, technology, and society that have to do in part with this phenomenon of second viewing, binge watching not so much for the news, and the role of the many personal screens in our social lives. Because it is fairly new, it is obviously an understudied phenomenon. Even a recent book that came out, I think it was in February of this year, by two University of Missouri researchers, at the beginning of the book, they said this topic has received very limited systematic research attention. In particular, I would claim, among the younger segments of population, which for a topic like this are a little bit of the avant-garde of what might apply, more significantly to other segments of population. Now, the book and the talk is called Social Network News because it's a little bit of a nod to the past and looking forward. Network news as sort of a proxy for how we consume the news more purposefully, deliberately, and social networks as the main platform through which incidental news consumption has moved from the periphery to the center. I am aware that social networks has multiple meanings, so in this case I'll take it as a synonym of social media. If there are any social network analysts in the room, I apologize for the confusion. I'm not going to be talking about degree centrality of any of those things. Okay? All right. So in this project we try to answer three major questions. The first one is how this is happening. What is the experience of the people accessing the news incidentally? What are the practices? What are the interpretations? And what is the affect associated with this transformation in the world of receiving and consuming the news? Second, we want to know why this is happening. How much of this is cognitive? How much of this is cultural? How much of this is structural? And the third one is, what does this mean? What does this mean for the media industry? What does this mean for the technology business? And what does it mean for culture and politics? Today, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the first issue. I'm going to give you some pointers of what we are thinking about in terms of the explanatory story, and I'm going to elaborate at the end about some of the implications that we see are important in relation to this phenomenon. To do this research, we are adopting what the former student of mine, Ignacio Siles, and I call in a series of articles a texto-material perspective, understanding that this is as much textual, as much having to do with content, and content is key. What we see here is very different for news and for entertainment content, even with the same hardware and the same software and the same people and the same practices. And I will share a little bit of that data with you. As it is technological, we can't really understand this story without understanding technological infrastructures, without understanding algorithms, and without understanding technological practices. So it is really at the intersection of the content and materiality, or the affordances, that this phenomenon is best made sense of. When I say that this is a discontinuous transformation for the most part, I say comparing this that we are seeing in our research with what we have known about the consumption of news in traditional media. By traditional media, I mean print and broadcast. For many, many decades of research, there are three main findings that are central for us to try to put our findings in historical context. Number one, the research since Leo Bogart, in the 50s actually, to the present, has shown that the consumption of news, much like the consumption of entertainment, is highly routinized. My late father used to read the newspaper every morning, sitting at the breakfast table in the same chair. He used to listen to radio news while shaving. I remember being a kid walking by bathroom and my dad hearing the news on the radio, right, while I was walking by the bathroom at home, while I knew he was shaving before going to work. Second, the consumption of news, again, much like entertainment, happens in fairly predictable temporal and spatial coordinates, right? It happens in, if you're listening to a radio, usually to and from work. If you are watching television, is in the living room. Stereotypically it was, not now, in the living room and in the evening. And finally, that the consumption of news in traditional media, and I would argue this is the main area of continuity with what's going on now, it was and still is highly integrated into the relational fabric of daily life. It's just that now how we live our interpersonal lives, right, how we communicate with other people, has changed dramatically from how we communicated 50, 60, 70 years ago. So routinization, predictability in terms of temporal and spatial coordinates, and deep integration with daily life. In terms of the consumption of news in digital media, where there has been a lot of research, in particular over the past 15 or so years, there are a couple of things that are relevant, particularly relevant for our story. Number one, at the beginning of the commercial web, in the mid-90s, when people like Dave Tewksbury or Scott Althaus started to do research on the consumption of news, the main question was whether there was going to be a displacement or / replacement effect, or whether the consumption of news in digital media was going to pile up on top of the existing time devoted, or energy devoted to the consumption of news in traditional media. And what the research found back then is that the beginning inklings of displacement, which by now has been well established, came in particular among the younger segments of population, which allow us in part to establish this idea that the young segment of the population tends to be, for some of these practices, a little bit of an avant-garde of what we see later. Second, that there has been a consistent finding of a connection, a strong connection between the consumption of news digitally and the use of mobile devices, right, particular smartphones. And the third important point for us is the emergence of what Alfred Hermida at British Columbia has called ambient journalism. For Al, it has been a story about the supply of information, right? Twitter in particular generates a kind of regime where information is part of the environment. Right? What we are taking is the reception side of the story and try to understand how this affects actually consumption practices, not so much supply side, but mostly demand side. In order to try to answer the questions that I showed you at the beginning, we have a mixed method approach. We have in-depth interviews. In this case, the data I'm going to present to you is from Argentina. We also have a comparative design, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. But we do in-depth interviews with people in various parts of the country, between 5 and 7 people a month. We started in March of last year. To date, we have done 93 interviews, about 40% of them with people who are 18 to 29, the focus of today's presentation. The rest with people who are 30 and older, which allow us to see that there are differences in terms of age groups. And even though I'm going to be focusing on the 18 to 29s, it's not where the data is coming exclusively from. That is, I'm not sampling on the dependent variables for the students in the room. The second source of data is an annual survey that we do face-to-face, old-fashioned, 700 people in the city of Buenos Aires and the surrounding towns, about 40% of the population in the country. We did the first survey in September of last year. We're going back to the field again in September, or probably between August and September of the current year. This is part of a larger comparative study that includes 5 different countries in 5 different continents in the world. We started doing research in the US in January this year. We are launching in Italy at the beginning of next month, in Israel between July and August, and in Japan in the fall of this year. I'm going to be focusing for the rest of the presentation, even though in the Q&A I can tell you how what we have here compares to the ongoing research that we are doing in the US. Again, I want to look at the younger segment of the population, which is where this phenomenon is expressed most intensely. Right? I take them as sort of functional sources of innovation in the parlance of von Hippel, or as early adopter, as Eb Rogers used to say, and try also to fill the gap in terms of how we understand the consumption of news among the young. In a recent article in Com Research by Sebastián Valenzuela and Ingrid Bachmann and Aguilar, they argue that studying younger citizens, how they acquire and develop the habit of consuming news is becoming ever more pressing, and I agree. So, in the interviews are open-ended for the most part. They are fairly, about 50 to 60 minutes of duration, but we try to make sure that there are 4 or 5 questions that we ask routinely, right, to all of our interviews. One of them has to do with, it usually happens halfway through the interview when people are more at ease and they told us something or other about their information habits, and they share that, oh, they have access to a computer, or they have a television at home, or they have a smartphone. We ask them to rank, right, in order of value to them, right, the different personal screens that they have in their daily lives, right? And the result is fairly consistent for this age group. This trumps it all, okay? Is the domain of the smartphone, then the computer, and then the television. Why the smartphone, right? Smartphone, cell phone, notebook, tablet, right? The cell phone without a doubt, then television, right? But when I watch TV, I'm also on my phone, apropos, this topics conference, and if I'm not watching TV, I'm still on my phone. What I use the most is the cell phone, then the TV, and then the computer. The TV because I can also navigate the internet on it. So I use it as a computer. Interview after interview after interview, the cell phone comes on top. In this particular age group, in this particular context, is a remarkable transformation. For my second book, News at Work, I did research with the same kind of population, including 66 in-depth interviews in Argentina in the years 2007 and 2008, and there it was all about the computer, right? And the main shift was from the desktop to the laptop. In less than 10 years, in terms of how people tell you what is important to them, the smartphone has moved clearly to the top. Why? 3 reasons that come up again, interview after interview after interview. You can do many things with a cell phone, right? The cell phone is always with you, and the cell phone allows you to be connected everywhere. Okay, I use the cell phone in multiple ways. I call, message, WhatsApp, Facebook, Netflix, music. I even listen to the radio on it. I have it with me all the time. It's like another hand, maybe a part of my body. The use of bodily metaphors, in particular upper extremities, in particular the hand, is very recurrent in the interviews. Right? Very, very, very present. I always have the cell phone at hand. It's more convenient than opening the computer or turning the television on. This, pointing to the phone, is always connected. The cell phone is always with me, with the exception of when I'm at Mass, right, when I go to church. So it's the only time in which part ways with the cell phone. I am very dependent on my cell phone. Maybe it's a part of my body. Another typical story that people volunteer a lot is, I left my phone at home, right? Oh my gosh, what do? I take the bus, 40 minutes back home, I grab my phone, 40 minutes later, it's 80 minutes, 40 plus 40, I'm back at work. The idea of parting ways with the phone for more than an hour or 2 is an unbearable thought for most of our interviews. What happens to the computer, which was to be the dominant personal screen in their lives less than 10 years ago? It has moved to a distant second place. For the most part, the computer to this crowd has what we call an instrumental use. It is used either for work or for school or for both if they are studying and working. And therefore, because it has an instrumental use, it has a negative affect associated with that. So work is not something that many of these people would do out of their own volition. The minute they stop working, the minute they move away from the computer. Okay? The computer is only to do college stuff. Okay? The computer is mainly for school and maybe for music. Very rarely, and we'll come back to this, for Facebook and Twitter. I use the computer very little. Okay? What about the TV? The TV, in survey after survey after survey, will show up as the main source of news for people. Because it is, in most of these households, always on. But this is where survey research and field research part ways, right? In field research, people will tell you, yes, it is there, but I rarely pay attention to that. And that's why when we ask them to rank the use, it comes in the distant background, and it's really part of ambient noise for the most part. including during national team soccer games in Argentina, which you understand is like religion. They are even more than religion. Most of the time, apropos this conference, people are following the game on Twitter, and they tell us that they have the TV on for sound, and when there is a major play, they lift their eyes and focus on the TV rather than on Twitter. Whenever I'm with the television set, I have my phone by my side. But I don't pay much attention right to what's going on TV, and this is the soccer story. I'm generally doing other things, and it is in the background. I pay minimal attention to that. I almost don't watch news on television. I normally learn about current events on social media. Print is not really a screen, but it's an interesting finding to contrast, to see that print for this crowd is, for the most part, a museum artifact of an era, right? That's called the 20th century, but that feels that it's more than 17 years ago, right? 17 feels like more like 117. In households where, if they live with their parents, where there is a print newspaper around, they will not touch it, with the exception of Sunday between 11 and 2, 11 in the morning and 2 p.m., family gathering, sociability patterns. Everybody sits around at the breakfast table or early lunch table, and they look at, they skim through different sections of the print newspaper. In addition to this cultural sort of routine, there is also an interesting ideological effect. A lot of our interviewees who are 18 to 29 have strong views about the environment, and they associate the print newspaper with negative environmental effects. So they do not want to have anything to do with something that causes damage to the environment. It's heavy, it's more cumbersome, and all of them say that they find navigating information here much easier than navigating that on print. I do like this, looking at scrolling down, because I finished reading it quite quickly. These different social lives of the many personal screens that we have in our daily existence is associated with the emergence of what we call living in the media. And this we take from Mark Deuse's book, right, Media Life, that for many of our young interviewees, they do not really seem to be using media artifacts as in the way that I use the phone, right? Or I use a print newspaper. They live in them. A lot of their lives happen in the media, and the face-to-face interaction is many times secondary in anything from romantic relations to information gathering to what happens in the media. They're all the time connected. If I'm doing nothing, I go on Twitter to see what other people write. I go on Facebook whenever I don't want to do anything else. Looking at Twitter is what I do the most when I'm in the bus. WhatsApp, which in here is a messaging tool, but in many other parts of the world where data plans, etc., are more expensive, has become a little bit of a social network. Right? So WhatsApp nowadays is like a tool, another hand. Everybody uses it, and it's super indispensable. I am on social media, tell us this person, 10 minutes an hour, and he has to clarify by not when I'm sleeping, as if it wasn't obvious. Perhaps some people are on social media when they are sleeping. I go on social media every day, and I don't know. I lose track of the number of times I do it. I am on social media when I'm free. I go to look and inform myself. There isn't a particular moment in which I log in. Remember, consumption of news in traditional media, very distinct temporal and spatial coordinates. This happens everywhere. The bus, the supermarket, walking down the street, you are stopping at the traffic light, etc., and all the times, everywhere. We have also some stories of people telling us that I'm not an addict, I can quit anytime. For a couple of months, I got off Facebook, but I realized that I was missing out so much that I have to come back to it, because a lot of life happens on Facebook. And we have this person who tells us that at the end of the day, he gets together with his girlfriend to have dinner every day. They live together, and they have the tacit rule of not using the cell phone so that we can talk about our days. But when she starts doing something else, like getting up to get the second plate or dessert, etc., I take advantage to catch up with my cell phone. Not through the cell phone, but with my cell phone. The affective valence, right, in the relation with the artifact is remarkably strong, interview after interview after interview, which is why, not surprising, that when we ask people in our survey of those who go on social media to tell us how frequently they go, over 90% of the people aged 18 to 29 go there either almost constantly and several times a day. They're all the time on. What is the favorite device that they use to access that? Very consistently with the interview data is this, right? 91% of the people who are 18 to 29 say that the favorite device to access, right, social networks is the mobile phone. And the tablet, gone. Remember when the iPad first came on board, that Rupert Murdoch made the visionary statement of saying, this is the future of digital news. Okay, this is what has happened to that statement. This is what has happened to the statement made by a person who also invested $500 million on MySpace, which probably wasn't the best purchase in the digital space. Sorry, Rupert, if you are looking, probably are not watching, so that's okay. When we ask people what is their favorite social network, and we include in the survey WhatsApp as a social network, because interview after interview after interview, people were telling us, when we ask them, what's your favorite social network? In the interviews, they would say WhatsApp. Can I include WhatsApp? Is that WhatsApp okay? So we include that in the survey to test that. It is these two, right? Again, we do not have 17 and younger. That's why Snapchat doesn't really register, okay? But, for those of you who are interested in the political economy of platforms, this is all Facebook, right? Facebook owns, WhatsApp as well, in addition to Instagram, which barely registers among the younger segment of the population. And it's interesting that the younger you are, the higher the probability that you will lean towards Facebook, and the older you are, the higher the probability that you would lean towards WhatsApp. WhatsApp mimics more the structure of, face-to-face interpersonal communication. Facebook broadens that up in interesting ways and has interesting incidents in the consumption of news. So at the intersection of, the primacy of the cell phone as the dominant screen, personal screen in our lives, and living our lives in the media, emerges this transformation of incidental news as something that is in the periphery to something that moves to the center. Consistent with the Pew and with the Reuters findings, we find that when we ask people, about this statement, news shows up when I navigate social media, those who are 18 to 29, 75% plus of them either agree or strongly agree, and that figure goes down as we age, even though it is still fairly strong. It's about 52% for those who are 60 years and older. How does this happen in daily life? People say, news come across when I'm in the moment of leisure and on Facebook, so I consume them there and then. Okay? I learned about, for instance, an earthquake in Italy on 9gag because an Italian posted about it, and 2 days later, I saw it on TV. Everything is so immediate these days. Many stories, I don't even have to look at La Nación, which is a very important newspaper and has a very well-designed news site, because on Twitter, when there is something happening, you do a refresh on your Twitter and you find out because somebody retweeted somebody else who was on the scene. Right? So consistent, again, with the Pew data, people do not go primarily to the main sites. They just know that they are going to find it on social media, or they don't know, but they find it nonetheless. It's more dynamic to access news on social media, to avoid going on so many websites. Have everything in a single place, what's going on in my social environment and what's going on in the real environment. And it's very interesting how, right? So the social environment is interpersonal communication, and the real environment is the real world. But everything happens and is available in social media. I don't visit, again, lanacion.com because I don't like it. I don't have the habit. So I took advantage to do that I have the social network habit. Okay, so this is more the cognitive, right, rational explanation, and this is the cultural explanation. I do it because it's more efficient, and I do it because is part of a habit, and what we are trying to tease out is how much of each is playing a role. So what happens when people access news primarily in an incidental fashion on social media through their cell phone is that reading and sense-making changes. Right? Reading becomes much shorter in terms of duration. Again, this is consistent with Nielsen and Comscore data that would tell you that if the same website access on its side, not on social media, on the computer versus a mobile device, people spend about between 2.5 and 3 more time, right, on the computer rather than the mobile device. It's even more when you are accessing here, right, because you are on Facebook in the bus. Right? So, oh, there is a story. You click on the stop here, so you stop and you exit the bus. Then you are walking down the street, you continue, then there is a traffic light, you stop. So it is fairly brief, it is interrupted, and it's all the time everywhere. Every moment that people seem to have to kill time. Going back to 2008 and 2007 and 2008, when I did research for News at Work, this idea of time filler was played by the computer. But that meant being in a particular location, static, not in transit, etc., etc. Now it has acquired a very different character. So I read the headline, I look at the image, and if it interests me, I click on the link and might email it myself and open it later. I read superficially, unless I am very interested in that. I'm always checking on my phone, but I can't look at anything in depth because I'm working or I am at school. Do you remember how much time you spent reading that news story? Well, it had 150 characters, wrong, 140. So it was quick. Okay, so again, fast, interrupted, and partial. So, to wrap things up, I have 10 minutes. So to wrap things up, so number one, in terms of the experiential dimension of consuming the news incidentally through social media, it really emerges at the intersection of a triad of information availability, right? If the stories were not available on social media, we would not consume the news this way. Hardware, right? Not everybody has access to this, and not everybody configures this in the same way, right? And the algorithms, the platforms, the affordances of the different platforms, and how the people, some people do, some people don't, configure those of them. Second, it is part of what we call, for lack of a better word, living in the media, right? So it is not something that you do separate from your media practices. In that sense, it is very functional, right? And it is ambient. It is everywhere, surrounding, right, the access of information. People used to distinguish in the literature, right, incidental news consumption for or passive learning, in the political science idiom, etc., from the more deliberate, right, form or purposeful form of news consumption, in part through an understanding of intentionality. Right? That one thing is accidental, the other thing is deliberate. What we see here is something that it is somewhere in between. It's not that people are completely oblivious to the fact that they might find stories. Right? Oh, really? There is a story on Facebook. Maybe 3 years ago, that was the case. Nowadays, in particular, our crowd has an idea that they might find a story on Facebook. But they don't go on Facebook primarily to get those stories, and they don't always think, or Twitter for that matter, that they're going to find those stories on Facebook. So what we see is that the kind of intentionality that they seem to enact, is intentionality that is somewhat hybrid or diffuse, that is in between something that is purely accidental and something that is totally deliberate. And that marks a different way of positioning as a subject vis-a-vis the information. And it is very different, for instance, from the consumption of entertainment content in the same devices, by the same person, in the same day. People actually set aside time to watch Game of Thrones. They do it in a routine fashion. They do it almost always in the same space in the household, and many times as part of a group activity. Girlfriend, boyfriend, friends, sometimes siblings, sometimes family members. So it's not really only about information availability, because that information is available also through the same media. But it is, in part, at the intersection of the content and the materiality, and that's why the texto-material perspective helps us tease out that. Second, or fourth, sorry, there seems to be a little bit of a trade-off between depth of information acquisition and breadth of information acquisition. Clearly, we are seeing a lack of depth, and that is consistent with time spent reading news, study after study after study, etc. But I don't think we should be nostalgic, right? We can say, oh, you know, the 20th century, for those of us who really live most of our lives in that century, was so great. It brought us Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, and democracy was so much better, blah, blah. I think that attitude in part will get us nowhere. There is a lot that is quite interesting about being surrounded by a lot of information all the time. And I mean, if there was one way of measuring, you know, political knowledge, for instance, that move beyond the superficial of how many Supreme Court judges do you know, can you name the representatives in your state, etc., we might find probably that we do not, particularly this generation doesn't know less than before. It just knows differently, right? Because it allows them to be all the time connected by, you know, through other people, you know, about information, and that might have interesting political effects that might not entirely be negative. The dominant affect, and this is very important when we think about, you know, the future of news enterprises, of consuming news this way, and there are differences depending on the topic, but the dominant affect is fairly nonchalant, right? Fairly detached. There are exceptions. We are seeing somewhat of a different take in the interviews here in the US post-election. We still see that, but you know, we ask people, when was the last time that you consumed news? Well, it was this morning. You know, I was going to campus and I was on my phone and I watched it. And what was the story about? I don't remember, right? So there isn't much of, you know, a strong association with that. My favorite answer to that question is when we try to probe and, you know, we ask, so really, what was the last piece of news that you really remember, right, that you consumed? My favorite story was one person say, oh, remember the miners who are trapped in Chile? So there's already a movie about that. So that's how old that story is. But the dominant affect is not an affect that is very strong or with a lot of connection. It's fairly detached. And the other important implication, we think, is that, you know, if you think about a news story in print, in radio, in TV, it is contextualized within the context, sorry for redundancy, of many other stories. There are editors that are thinking of all the events in the world. We are going to cover, if you're in a newspaper, these 60, tomorrow's edition, and we're going to say that these 5 go on the front page and the others go elsewhere, and so on and so forth. So any piece of news is contextualized within a whole narrative of the day or the week or whatever, you know, news period we're talking about, and it has a particular hierarchy within that totality, and it has a hierarchy in daily life. It's not the same having a story on the front page of the New York Times or finding out that your neighbor had the refrigerator broken. But on Facebook, the two are in the same plane. First, the news report is decontextualized from whatever edited totality the news organization presented, and second, it loses the hierarchy, right? And that has important implications in terms of reception. So what we see historically is that there seems to be significant discontinuity with the dominant patterns of accessing information in traditional media. We see some continuity regarding the implication of news reception, news consumption in sociability patterns of daily life. Even though those sociability patterns have changed, they are still, you know, the dominant ways in which we live. But in terms of routinization, right, there are many different routines now. There isn't just one major routine, right? There are many. So I did consuming news going on the bus, consuming news when I wake up in the morning, or when I don't have anything to do, when I go out with my friends, you know, in the movie theater. Oh, I don't like this preview, so let me check the sports scores, and then, I mean, when the movie starts, I'm gonna look at entertainment, and so on and so forth. And it happens, as opposed to one time, one place, it happens all the time or anytime, everywhere. And the importance of looking at both technology and content allows us to understand that this really emerges at, you know, the intersection of hardware, software, and the availability of information. What factors from our interview data and primarily from our survey seem to show causal force. Age, which is very, very strong, controlling for all the other demographic variables. Where do you live? Where do you work? What access you have to technology, what's your favorite social network, and so on and so forth. Age is by far the strongest effect. In a country like Argentina, and this is why comparative study is very important, where 31 to 32% of the population live under the level of poverty, so not everybody might have access to this, and if they do, they might not have data plans where they can spend a lot of time in them. Socioeconomic status is also a significant variable, and what is, in terms of technology, what is your social, what's your favorite social network also has an important causal role. In the chart that I show you in the 5-point scale, news show up when I navigate social media from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The probability of moving from one category to the other, controlling for all the other variables, decreases by 53% if your favorite social network is WhatsApp. Right? Even controlling for age. Remember, WhatsApp was the dominant social network for the older segment of the population. So WhatsApp, so what we are seeing is that when we talk about social media, really it doesn't have enough heuristic power because there are many different tools and many different platforms, and in particular the younger people, also the older people, have developed a series of practices, protocols, and experiences that are related to the different social media platforms, and they use them for different reasons in different times. So you post a picture on Instagram at 6:30 on a Saturday if you want to get attention from the guys and the gals, because that's when they are looking, right? But you go and find things out about your neighborhood on WhatsApp, or you learn about the world on Facebook, right? So the study of social media in part probably would benefit by moving more in a comparative dimension. But when I say comparative, I mean comparing across the different platforms. A whole lot of the literature looks at one platform at a time, and that's not, really not catching a lot of the use that we see. In terms of theory building, and that's the main goal for us, is try to figure out how much of this has to do with information access and information processing. It is much more efficient to access information here than to access information on the TV, right? And for certain people, and this is where biology plays a role. I mean, if you are 45 and older, your eyes start to get watery when you spend a lot of time looking at screens, and people do say that in the interview. They prefer other screens like the TV, or they prefer the paper. But how much of this is cognitive, right? How much of this is sociocultural? How much of this has to do with the fact that we now have social routines and communication routines where social media and the use of the phone is central, so the consumption of news gets smuggled there, but not the consumption of entertainment, right? And how much of this really is structural, having to do with demographic factors, technological infrastructure, and also the supply of information. Why is it that this applies so strongly for news, but not so strongly for entertainment, right? Given that the two kinds of contents are available more or less in the same way in the same platform. So in terms of some implications, do I have? Sure? Okay. In 3 minutes, I'll choose a couple here. Elihu Katz and colleagues told us about 60 plus years ago about the importance of the second step, right? The two-step flow, the media presenting an agenda, and then social intermediaries, intermediating that agenda, and being a two-step flow of information in society. What we are seeing here is that there is a three-step flow, right, in a sense, right, where the social contacts in the social network are mediating, right, in part the interpersonal ones, and they're doing it in a way that happens in a different, with a different dynamics, with the rise of what other people have called personal publics, where you're enacting a process of influence with many, many more others, right? Where many others comment, like, etc., what you do and what you say in social media. What that does is it shifts power, right, from media organizations and from your co-located face-to-face social network, in part to the social media contacts and the social media platforms, which take advantage of that to monetize that in terms of advertising revenue. Because related to that is a transfer of brand power from, and brand trust from media organizations. It comes up in interviews again and again. I don't trust, the New York Times, or I don't trust La Nación, but I trust my friend Johnny. So if Johnny posted that, then I'm going to look at it, right? So trust, in particular in a country like Argentina or in a country like the US, is fairly low for the media as a social institution. It's much higher for the social contacts that you have chosen, so you get transferred there, and the platforms monetize that because they don't pay any of us for the news that we share, the news that we like, and the news that we comment on. But they basically are monetizing trust. What I said before, again, the media have become an environment. For many, 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 many years, we, human beings had only one, environment, which was the natural environment. When we stopped being nomad, we, settled, and we had villages, then we had cities, etc. And we know, through many studies in urban sociology and so on and so forth, that the urban environment is as powerful, many times, as the natural environment. What we are seeing here is the rise of the media as a third environment that coexists with, many of them have very interesting stories about political campaigning and the role of the media environment in relation to the urban environment in this case, and political advertisement. Can share with you later. And I will stop there because then this will take me more time. I want to leave time for questions. So thank you very much. And this is the team. It's a team effort.
Absolutely. Thanks much for a riveting talk and a great start to the workshop. I think it is a good idea to open up for questions and answers from the audience members.
Homero.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks for sharing with us. Okay. Thank you. So I said it again. Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you for the presentation. It is very interesting, and one of the things that I find particularly useful for us is that we are seeing very similar findings. It's kind of like looking at one geometric figure from different angles. And seeing this data based on qualitative work in a different country, it's reconforting in that sense. And it speaks to one of the things that I've been trying to deal with for quite some time. I think you're right about many things, and the challenge that you face now is what you're going to do next and how you're going to make sense of the effects. But it seems to me that one of the effects that we're seeing with all these social media and technologies, and that we need to parse out much better, is that it is very positive for certain aspects of pro-democratic life. But it's also very negative in some respects. And all these amalgam of effects take place at the exact same time and at the exact same place. This ubiquity place that you described. So I want to take and pick your brain, and even if it's a little bit speculating at this point, because I know that you're starting with the project, but it seems to me that all this filling time that when people are consuming information or even in different screens, it is useful to them to have the feeling and perception that they're informed. And you cited my new paper on that, and the news finds perception. Correct. But I want to go beyond that. I think it is really positive for certain aspects of what they do. It is really mobilizing them. It is really connecting each other and find out what are the important issues that they should be paying attention and maybe participate in their communities, whether they are virtual or face-to-face communities. But consistently, we find that they're not learning much. And I'm starting to think that I use the exact same sentence that you use quite some times. The idea that it is not we need to dive into what kind of learning process is taking place. They're learning stuff. Maybe they're not learning what the opinion others have been telling us what is important to learn about democracy, but these people are learning something. I'm losing the battle. I'm not so sure they're not learning. They're not learning that much. And my problem with that is twofold, and I'd like to pick your brain on this. The first one is, if there's a path to learning, to political knowledge, what is it that they're learning? Because they don't seem to recall anything about it. Like you just say, like, no, I can't remember anything about the news. Oh yeah, remember these Chileans, they got lost in the mine. Yeah, that was 3 years ago. So they don't recall things. And the second one is the elaboration process, right? That the chief people and others and colleagues working on this idea of which is as important as discussion. When we read the news, we consume the news, we discuss with each other about the news that we consume, and that is a good process of elaborating cognitively about the important issues in public affairs in our society and why they matter and so on and so forth. If they're not thinking about it, they're not learning that much, and they're not thinking about it, what is happening? Because they're participating a lot. So what is happening?
That's a great question. No, it's a fascinating question. We've been wrestling with that. In particular, in the context of the data from the US that we get, we have about 40 interviews now since we started in January. And Argentina is ramping up to going to fairly contested midterm elections, so I'm assuming we're going to see some of the same. So one mechanism that we see a lot, and there is precedent in the literature that has been going on that might account for not a lot of learning, but significant participation, mobilization to a certain degree, has to do with what we call, for lack of better word, if you have a better word, please feel free to share with us, an everyday strategy of network purification. So a lot of our interviewees shared with us in the US that over the past, since the summer basically, when the primaries ended, they've been purifying their contact portfolio, in particular on Facebook. So if you think about Facebook over the past 10 years, it became, a way of reuniting with lost long, contacts. Oh, my friend from elementary school. Oh, I used to play soccer with that guy when I was in kindergarten. Went to college with that person. I haven't seen him in 20 years. In my case, more than 20, etc., right? So you are friends, 30, 40, 20 years ago. You don't know what they think now. But they are all friends in Facebook. So people have been telling us that they've basically been defriending anybody, in particular in the US, very common during the electoral season in Argentina in 2015, who espouses very strong views that are opposed to the views of the main actor. Right? Anybody who thinks differently, basically. Like homophily, we know, is a very powerful driver of human behavior. So people reflect on this without even us asking. So I know that that's no good, right? I just can't bear it. Oh, I think what they're posting, right? So the affective tonality is very strong, as opposed to the detached element with the news, right? So if the everyday, because that's the everyday underpinning of polarization. If your everyday practice is one of purifying your contact to, achieve a fairly homophilic or homophilous social network, what you're going to have there, right, is a lot of the same, right, which will reinforce what you know, but you will not learn that much in that sense. You will know a little bit more about what you already knew, but learning has to do with confronting difference, right? But, and we know from the work of Diana Matz, that when, right, you hear the other side, that is related negatively to political participation, right, and mobilization. So hearing the same reinforces participation, but the learning measured as, confronting and acquiring information that is new to you goes down. But the driver there, interesting enough, is neither, it's not rational really, and it's not value driven, because people express a certain level of guilt, right? Has to do with it's at the intersection of really ideology and emotion, right? That I can't bear. It has become so charged that I can't bear the thought of, right? So that's one reflection that I can share. But we've seen this very, in a very strong way in the US. We started collecting data in Argentina in March 2016. Basically 3 months after the current administration took office, after a very sort of acrimonious political period. People tell us that they used to do that before. Now things have subsided, and, at the sort of in terms of the ideological conflict, so that has gone down. But it is consistent. Nick Jones and Shira Grossman at Tel Aviv have a paper in Journal of Communication that shows that the rate of unfriending in Israel during one of the most recent conflicts was about over 25% of people in their sample unfriended during a major political conflict. So it is kind of consistent across countries, and I think that might contribute to the effect that you see. So we haven't measured learning per se, but the effect that you see. That's as much as I can share.
We could just maybe have time for one more question, and then we'll start with our lunch roundtable. Peppino, I know you had a question or comment you wanted to add.
Just one question out of many. I'm Peppino Ortoleva from Torino. My question is, are we still speaking of news? This is not an easy question, because news is not a natural thing. It's a historical artifact. Newspapers make news. Television makes news. Do social network make news in the same sense? Or are we speaking of something that is larger and narrower according to the cases? The dimensions of how facts take form is changing in what you are saying.
I understand. Buongiorno Peppino, molto grazie. I had to practice my Italian. Buona fine Buenos Aires person. I know a few words in Italian. So that's a great question. So the news is a cultural and historical achievement, right? And it has shifted across time. I mean, the people in the field have documented this very well. Two observations there. One is, from the standpoint of the field research, we do adopt an emic perspective. So when we ask people, when was the last time you consumed news? They tell us, what do you mean by news? Whatever you mean by news. Most of our interviewees tend to think that news is public affairs news. So many times within like 5 or 10 minutes into the interview, but when they don't remember what was the last story that I consumed, but can we talk about tennis? Or can we talk about soccer? I said, yeah, sure, you can talk about whatever you want. So there they remember a little bit more, sometimes surprisingly much more. But news for us, in that sense, is whatever the informant says is news. For the most part, it will be something that relates to the news reporting, print, on television, etc. Now, do social media platforms make news? It's a tricky question. Zuckerberg would say no, right? I would say yes. They perform an editorial function. They do not perform a reporting function, but they do perform an editorial function in the sense of selecting, the algorithm selects from the many, many possible bits of information which ones are going to be shown on a person's feed. And that's the same thing that an editor does, right? From all the possible events that we can report on, which ones are we going to report on, and how are we going to show them? And so in that sense, social media platforms do make news in the sense that they curate and present to us certain bits of information that we contribute to. As you know, the more we like, the more something is presented, the more we comment, and so on and so forth. Whether they, at certain point in the future, they will report news, remains to be seen. But to a certain degree, they play a very important editing role. And one might argue that nowadays, they have editorial power that is unparalleled in the history of journalism. With 1.2 billion every day logging in on Facebook, relative to the size of a country or a region, no other news outlet in history probably has had that much reach. So those would be my answers. You want to?
I think in the interest of trying to keep on to the time and starting with lunch, which should be set up in the atrium, I think we'll break there. But of course, continue with the conversations as we go forward. So thanks again.
Oh, thank you. Los Angeles Times, editor, what do you think of all this?
I was the Miami Herald. I'll tell you what is the most trouble. And I'm sure he said there. Also, there is a hard time to send it to the public party. When we see these surveys, they ask people.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm totally.
Tom, please for being here today. Wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, someone said the issue.
No problem. It's when incidental science. And frequently in my we thought about
Was this okay? Okay. I think it will play well with Omero's environment.
young people would tell us that they didn't search for news, they encountered it because it was there. In all of this is we ask people where they get their news. But it's not really where the news came from. The news for the most part came from this is the maker. It comes from, in most cases, from organizations. The frustration is that we have a generation that does not really, they don't even understand what the because they don't go to
I know.
which has led to a generation that is surrounded perhaps by more news and information than yes. Yeah. They don't know really where it came from.
It's not that the source is closed. It's just that the presence has decreased relative to yes. Signori, buongiorno.
Anyhow.
Thank you very much.